Well, I have to tell you guys, I am very excited to be here to tell you these stories. This is 4 years in the making, and this is actually the book that started my publishing journey. The story is that I discovered this and thought, well, this is definitely worth a book. People need to know these stories. It needs to be recorded in a way that it's accessible for future generations. But when I contacted the publishing company, they said, well, we're not really interested in that, but we are looking for someone to write hidden history. So that is how we got to that. And then they contacted me about a year ago and asked if I was still interested in writing about this. Of course, I jumped at the opportunity. And so I've really enjoyed researching these stories. I've learned a lot personally about how to research and where to research the different documents that are available. I was also very happy that I got to interview some of the siblings and children of some of these men. Unfortunately, I started the project too late to have been able to visit with them in person. But there are some primary sources out there. Some of them have been interviewed for the Library of Congress, and so they have their oral histories there. One of these men had been interviewed by KJLU on the Lincoln campus, and so they had an oral history that we actually discovered we had a copy of here at the archive, so that was definitely a fun find to find that here. So to kind of get you in a frame of mind here what we're going to talk about, we're going to start about 1940, and the setting is Lincoln is about to add its journalism school and its law school for graduate programs because MU was segregated and the lawsuits had said we're still going to have separate but equal. That means Lincoln will provide these programs. So it was on its way to becoming the Black Harvard of the Midwest. In Jefferson City, we had only had an airfield here for about 10 years or so. And to clarify, it's not the municipal airfield that we know today. This was actually about where Turkey Creek Golf Course is on the west side of the highway. And in the U.S., we were kind of looking at, we're going to be entering the World War at some point, and we had an astonishingly low number of trained pilots, civilian or military. So they were looking at ways to correct that. But let me point out that that was only for white military aviation, because in 1940 there was no arm yet where black men could join the military and serve in an aviation capacity. So to cap that off, in 1940 there were less than 200 African Americans who had a pilot's license of any kind. That's to just give you an idea of where we're starting from. So let me introduce you to Wilbur Long, and I got to interview his sister, Naomi, who was the Poet Laureate of Detroit, and she was lovely. She's since passed on, but I was so grateful to get to visit with her. So Wilbur grew up in a home with a teacher and a preacher, so education and character were definitely priorities, but flying was definitely his love. He was born in Virginia. They moved to St. Louis when his father, as a preacher, got a job there, attended Harris Teachers College, and took some flying lessons at Curtis Wright School in East St. Louis. So then he heard in 1940 that Lincoln University of Missouri was awarded the Civil Pilot Training Program contract. So he signed up. He was one of the 10 selected from 65 applicants. This was a really big deal for the Civil Pilot Training Program to come to Lincoln. We will definitely talk about that more, but let me just start with the Civil Pilot Training Program came out of the need to train pilots, but the government wasn't ready to commit to we're going to war, so they kind of made it a civilian program to train pilots. But when they created the program, again, there was no military arm to funnel those trained pilots into, black schools be part of this training program. But there was lobbying done by the NAACP and by the Pullman Porters Union, and so they allowed a trial group of 6, what we know as HBCUs today, that had that program when it started in 1939. And because those 6 colleges did so well, that's how Lincoln, the following year, was able to have the civilian pilot training program come here. So Wilbur was among those first 10 cadets. They started at this Jefferson Airfield in September 16, 1940. The reason that that date is unique is because it was the same day that President Roosevelt signed the Selective Service Act. And the result of the Selective Service Act, which said that there had to be an arm in the military to take the same percentage of the population for blacks and whites. So essentially that meant that the U.S. Army Air Corps, because the Air Force wasn't created yet, was now required to create an arm that they had at least 10% of their airmen were black, because that was the percentage of the regular population. So, not surprising, Wilbur was the first to solo flight in his class, and it made national news. The national news was definitely following Lincoln's progress and the progress of these first 10 students. And he loved flying so much that he left Lincoln after just that one semester. He got his training in and he moved on to Chicago, where the Cornelius Coffey School of Aeronautics was under Willa Brown. Willa was the first American woman to hold both a commercial pilot's license and a mechanic's license. You may recognize her as the co-founder with her husband of the first flight school owned and operated by African Americans. So Wilbur went on from there and eventually wound up at Tuskegee. He was one of 5 Lincolnites who earned their wings at Tuskegee. It was very difficult to make it through all of the levels of training that they had to. There was a very high washout rate, and so the success of these 5 was pretty remarkable. So he went to Europe in the summer of 1944 as a replacement with the 332nd Fighter Group. And we might know them as Red Tails. That's because when they were flying the B-51 Mustangs, everyone had to have a color on their wing or on their tail, so that when they were up in the air they could tell which squadron was which, and that they just painted theirs red. So that's how they became the Red Tails. So Wilbur was a Red Tail for 15 missions. He was escorting bombers from their base in Italy to an oil refinery that was near Berlin. And he and his plane were hit by flak and thought he could make it home, and it was pretty evident soon that he couldn't make it home. He tried to open the canopy so he could parachute out and discovered that the flak had damaged the canopy. So then he decided he was going to have to try and find a place to do a belly landing. And what he thought was an open field turned out to be just a very dense forest. So he wound up doing a belly landing into a forest, and he was captured by a civilian mob who probably would have beat him to death if he hadn't been rescued by German soldiers. He was treated by the village doctor, interrogated by a Hungarian colonel, and then he was taken to Stalag Luft 3. You might recognize that as the same site where the people featured in The Great Escape were there. That was a housing primarily for POWs who came from British and American airmen. And he found there that they were more racially integrated than a lot of the places in the American South. I found that to be very interesting. They were finally freed in April of 1945. He received the Air Medal Purple Heart, and when he returned, he was a flight instructor at Tuskegee. All right, so some background. It took a lot of moving pieces to come together for this program to be here. There are some leadership roles that were very essential at Lincoln to make this possible. So one of those was President Sherman Scruggs. He was in the process of hiring the top men and women in their fields to come to Lincoln to build a strong liberal arts program. And Scruggs knew the value of both military service and education. He was an ag teacher in Mississippi when he enlisted in World War I. He deployed with the infantry to France, where he was recognized for his bravery at the Battle of Belleau Wood by carrying messages between the units. From there, he was one of the few black men selected for an officer candidate school, and he returned as a lieutenant, one of the few that were not black chaplains at the time. So we have President Scruggs leading the way, and one of the programs that he was most interested in was the mechanical arts program, which the civil pilot training program was under. And it was George Robert Cotton who was involved in that program. And he had graduated from Hampton Institute with his bachelor's and earned his master's at Kansas State Teachers College in Pittsburgh. The New York Age called Cotton one of the most active exponents of the Booker T. Washington philosophy of Negro life in the Middle West. So he arrived at Lincoln in 1938 as the only mechanical arts instructor, but they had just completed Daniel Hall, which held the entire mechanical arts program at the time, so they were really forward-looking. So within 2 years, he had built a faculty of 6 experts in their field. The degree programs included printing presses, building engineering and construction, mechanical arts, and industrial arts. But Cotton believed that aviation and the coming defense programs would really provide opportunities for his African-American students, and that turned out to be true. So by 1941, well, 3 years after Cotton had arrived, the enrollment in the mechanical arts program had leapt from 9 students to more than 100. And then there's Charles Malcolm Ashe. And if his last name sounds familiar, he does share a paternal grandfather with the tennis legend Arthur Ashe. So he taught the inaugural class of the Lincoln CPT. He was one of, I think, 3 black licensed flight instructors at the time. And so he was highly sought after. There were both black and white schools on the East Coast who were trying to get him to come and teach at their programs. And he said that he chose to come to Lincoln because I was impressed with the magnitude and seriousness revealed in President Scruggs' personality. So he did what they called barefoot flying because a lot of the students hadn't ever been in an airplane before. They had a hard time kind of getting a feel for the controls. So he had them take their shoes off. So in their sock feet, they were learning how to fly and feel the controls. And again, this is the same class that Wilbur Long was in that received a lot of interest and coverage from the national black newspapers. So he only stayed here for 1 semester because there was a delay in the CPT program being approved by the federal government for a 2nd semester, and so he moved on in the meantime. And he went on to challenge the Royal Air Force Ferry Command's racist policies with the NAACP, and those were eventually overturned by Winston Churchill. And then he ended up as a flight instructor at Tuskegee. After the war, at the end of his career, he was at Andrews Air Force Base working on presidential planes. And this photo hangs in the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum on its wall of honor. All right. So the key piece to all of these other moving pieces coming together is the fact that our local airfield opened its doors to black aviation. That was not the case across the board, across the nation. They were almost all whites-only airfields. So this is a very unique component that we had that the Robertson Aircraft Corporation out of St. Louis owned the field at the time and operated it. And so they were willing to do that, to partner with Lincoln to provide, as he said, the only program west of the Mississippi exclusively for black pilots. And he they had the year before already offered the program to white students from Jefferson City Community College. So starting the program wasn't a problem for them, and so they were ready to go with that. So nearly 50 cadets completed the Lincoln program during 5 courses that happened between 1940 and the last program was the spring of 42, before we really got started after Pearl Harbor. So as early as 1917, young black men were trying to enter the air service, but the government had policies where they thought that black men were not interested in aviation, they didn't have the dexterity, or they didn't have the intelligence. Well, the CPT was instrumental in proving those theories wrong and really helped pave the way for the Tuskegee Airmen program to come to fruition. It was first formed by the 99th Fighter Squadron, and that was organized in the spring of 1941. And and so several of our Lincoln CPT cadets went on to be Tuskegee Airmen, and that's what we're going to talk about the rest of the time. But I wanted to point out that almost all of those 50 cadets did serve in the military in some capacity, and there were several from Lincoln who did not take the CPT program who also wound up as Tuskegee Airmen as well. So it was a really fascinating journey to track down all of these young men. All right, so the support crew versus the pilots was probably about 10 to 1. There were so many other support roles that needed to be filled. Plus, if you had the men that had tried to go through the aviation program and they were washed out, then you still needed to find a place with those skills to put them and put them to good use. So most of our Lincolnites were in ground crew of some kind. Clovis Bordeaux up there, I got to visit with his son. His son was actually the first family member that I was able to talk to, and he really helped me to kind of get a vision for how to tell this story, and gave me the gravity of how important this story is to tell. So Clovis Bordeaux was part of the 99th. He was among those very, very first black men to enter aviation. However, he did not like flying. What happened was he had graduated from Lincoln with dual degrees in math and physics. He earned a radio operator's license in Milwaukee, but racism kept him from getting into the industry. And so he was looking for a steady paycheck. He was still supporting his widowed mother and his younger siblings. So he felt like the military was a good place to get that steady paycheck. His son told the story that all the ground crew were required to log so many hours in the air with the pilots, and he just dreaded that more than anything. Everyone else was lining up, and he did not want to do it at all. So he deployed to North Africa in April of 1943 with the 99th. That was the earliest that any military aviation arm, black military aviation arm, had gone overseas. And he was among the 292 non-commissioned officers that left with 28 pilots, and then, of course, all of the privates that went with them. They averaged 2 missions a day, and that required him as a communications officer to repair the radios and keep them flying and ready to go. After the invasion of Sicily, they were moved to a base in Italy. And we're going to talk more about him later. He's a pretty special fellow. And down here we've got Ozzie Farquhar, and he was part of the 332nd Fighter Group. The 332nd was formed after the 99th to create more opportunities and more places for pilots and the other elements that come along with the aviation. So Ozzie was a mail clerk, and there were some nice letters written back about him. People really appreciated him, as you would think, being overseas looking for mail. They would certainly appreciate seeing him coming. And when he came back, he married his high school sweetheart, and they moved to Orange County, California, where he became the first black postal carrier there, and she was the first black school teacher. And then we have Charles Ford. I bet several of you are familiar with him. He was a football line coach for 1 year here at Lincoln before he enlisted. And he had attended Lincoln himself, but then he kind of wandered a little bit, found himself in Texas, and actually graduated from Bishop College down in Texas. He had come back to Missouri to teach and had just come back to Lincoln when the war began. And so when he enlisted, he was one of only 9 African Americans who were invited to attend the U.S. Army Air Force Physical Training School. Only those who had PE degrees or experience in the field were invited. And because of this training, he was eligible for Officer Candidate School, which he later completed. He was sent to Keesler Field, Mississippi, which was the basic training school for those who were going to go on to Tuskegee to learn to fly, or their other components that they were going to be responsible for. So it makes me wonder, what would that have been like? You see him as your football coach, right? And then the war happens, and people go their separate ways, and then you wind up at Keesler Field, and you show up for your first day of PT, and there's your old football coach showing you what to do for the military PT. That had to have been pretty neat. So a year later, he was assigned to Tuskegee. So I think there was a couple of months in 1943 where we had more than 20 Lincolnites at Tuskegee at the same time. So that was pretty neat. Milton Lemons, he was a biology major at Lincoln. And after the war, he returned to complete his degree. And although he had been in the CPT program, he did wash out of the flight training. So he worked in the support crew. He was a sergeant and gunnery instructor. He is one of 3 Lincolnites who are featured in the Black Americans in Flight mural at the Lambert Airport. Winston Rogers, he was an Olympic-level track star from Kansas. He came to Lincoln as a track star and a PE major, but once he took the CPT course, he changed his mode. He dropped out of school. He headed off to Chinook Field to earn his commercial pilot's license, and then he became a flight instructor there. He happened to be drafted before he got his letter to go to Tuskegee, so he became a supply sergeant at Jefferson Barracks and continued to send letters saying, I know I can serve the military better if you can just get me to Tuskegee. So he did eventually make it to Tuskegee, but that was as a primary flight instructor. So he was disappointed by that. Reading through some of his letters and correspondence, he continued to try and become a pilot. Fighter pilot, and they continued to tell him this is where you need to be. He stayed in the Army Air Corps after the war, re-enlisting and serving in the Philippines as well. He eventually completed his education degree at Pittsburgh, Kansas, and they said that he excelled in no less than 8 sports while he was there. All right, and then Finis Holt. He graduated with an economics degree before the CPT program had even come to Lincoln. And he was hoping to work his way through graduate school, but it was the end of the Depression, and he was having a hard time finding work. So he found himself in Michigan working at an ironworks when he enlisted to be part of the Tuskegee Airmen. And he attended advanced technical schools in Illinois, Missouri, and Wisconsin for radio transmission and repair. And he also deployed with the 332nd as replacements in 1944. And while he was in Italy, he worked on the Bendix radios that they had in the fighter planes, and sometimes they would fly as many as 5 missions a day. So that meant as soon as the fighter pilots came back, hopped out and did their reports and got something to eat before they came back, that was the time he had to repair the radios. If they had been shot through with bullets, they had to find the parts they needed to fix them up. And he also drove a truck with antenna equipment, and he would drive out into the field as close as he could, or as far away as he could get from the base, so that the wayward pilots coming back that maybe they were unable to communicate with the base directly, he would help them find their way home. And it was said that he would not bring his truck back until the very last plane had come in from a mission. go. Okay. So, just to clarify, Tuskegee Airmen are any of the first generation of those black aviators who worked in any capacity with aviation. So not just the pilots. But we did have 5 Lincolnites who did earn their wings at Tuskegee. And we talked about Wilbur Long. And also in Wilbur's class was Everett Bratcher. He was in that first course that was taught by Charles Ash. And Everett Bratcher was an engineering major at Lincoln. And when he graduated, he moved on to Tuskegee fairly quickly and joined the 332nd. And he was supposed to go with them to Europe, but then a medical condition came up that disqualified him. And so he became an armament chemical officer and served not only at Tuskegee, but South Carolina and Illinois. And we're going to talk about him a little bit later as well. He's got a really good story. Another good story is Stuart Fulbright. He had graduated from Lincoln with a French degree, and then he stayed on as a French professor. And he received his first call to service in January of 1943. He showed up at Jefferson Barracks as the only black man in a class of 22 recruits that were taking exams, both written and physical, and he turned out to be one of only 2 of those 22 that actually passed. And within 9 days, he received an honorable discharge with the Army apologizing, saying they made a mistake. So he went back to Lincoln for a few months before he received his call to go train at Tuskegee. And he was in the 2nd class at Tuskegee to receive twin engine training. That meant that he could fly the bombers. One of the lesser known pieces of the Tuskegee Airmen program is that they did have a bomber group, the 477. And so he was a pilot for a 6-man crew with a B-25 Mitchell bombers. And they were planning to deploy to the South Pacific when the bombs were dropped on Japan. So had that not happened, we would have a longer story of the success of the Tuskegee Airmen. So Fulbright actually remained in the Air Reserve through 1968, and he achieved the rank of captain and served as a flight instructor. All right. Now these are the guys that, if you know much about the Lincoln University and its connection with the Tuskegee Airmen, then these 2 men might be familiar to you. So Richard Pullum, his brother, was a longtime professor here, and at the time that he was serving overseas, his brother was at Lincoln, but he had 2 sisters who were also at Lincoln at that same time. And so he was from Kansas City, and Wendell Pruitt was from St. Louis, and they were in the 2nd CPT class. That was the one after Ash had left, and so they were actually taught by John Randolph, who was the white manager out at the airport while Lincoln was trying to find a new black flight instructor to do the Lincoln program. So they were in the same CPT course together. They were in the same fraternity on campus together. They enlisted at different locations. Pullum enlisted at Fort Riley, and Pruitt enlisted directly at Tuskegee. But somehow they wound up in the same class at Tuskegee, which that's just so unusual for that to have happened. It was just really interesting. So after they were commissioned as officers in December of 1942, Pullum became the first black pilot commissioned from Kansas City, and Pruitt the second from St. Louis. And they both deployed in early 1944 with the 332nd to Europe, but they were in different squadrons. Let's see, so there were less than 1,000 pilots that earned their wings through the Tuskegee program, but less than 300 of those actually went overseas and were fighter pilots. So our group of Lincolnites who were pilots is a pretty unique group. So while Pullum was growing as a formation leader and learning how to lead a group, Pruitt was known more for his aerial acrobatics. When they first arrived in Italy, he was almost suspended because he was flying maneuvers over Italian homes and kind of dancing his wheels off the top of the roofs. So he was known to do things that other pilots would not even think about doing. There was a quote that if Pruitt can't do it, it can't be done. Some of his dog fighting is featured in the History Channel's Dog Fights when they did an episode on the Tuskegee Airmen. So next time you pull that up, be sure to watch for Wendell Pruitt. His wingman said he was crazy, basically, but that he'd follow him anywhere. So there was someone who suggested that the character of Joe Lightning Little in the movie Red Tails might have been partly inspired by Pruitt. One of the other things that he did was he was part of the fighter group that permanently disabled an Italian destroyer using only their machine guns that they had on board, which was thought to be impossible. In fact, when they came back and said that they had done, the white leadership still didn't believe what they had done until they watched the film from their wing cameras. Then they couldn't deny it after that. So the 332nd arrived in Italy in February of 1944. They first flew the P-39 Air Cobras, and then they were given P-47 Thunderbolts, and then they finally landed the P-51 Mustangs. I'm not an airplane person, but they arrived and had these three planes within a matter of 3 months. So I just can't imagine what it was like for the mechanics and the pilots. Okay, let's figure out how this plane works. Oh no, now we've got a new plane. Let's figure out how this plane works. So, and then to do their jobs on top of that. Yeah, in the spring, they witnessed the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. They said that the ash was so thick that it disrupted all of their operations for many days, got in the engines, they had to clean everything out. So they did primarily fly escort for bombers. But it is not true that they never lost a bomber. They've lost very few. So what happened was a newspaper article very early on in the Tuskegee Airmen days reported that they had not lost a bomber, which was true at that point. But then over time they did have some losses, but that quote was so great that it just kind of kept carrying on. So that's kind of how that legend happened. So Wendell Pruitt rotated home after 70 missions and 350 combat hours. Compare that with only 50 hours for the white pilots to rotate home. The mayor of St. Louis declared a Captain Wendell Pruitt Day in his honor, and they recognized the fact that he had received the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal with 7 oblique clusters, and he was credited with shooting down 3 German planes in the air, 8 more on the ground, as well as disabling the destroyer. Pullum returned home a month later. He received the Distinguished Flying Cross, 2 major campaign stars, and the Air Medal with 4 oblique clusters. Now he returned home to his wife and his son, who was born while he was gone. So after their furloughs, Pruitt and Pullum were stationed at Tuskegee to become flight instructors. But in April of 1945, Pruitt was killed in a trainer plane crash. He had another, one of the support group that was just taking a ride with him. And it was a trainer plane, so they had 2 sticks, and he had been upside down, inverted and flying, and the plane went down, and the best they could come up with was the fellow who was in there with him got scared and grabbed the stick so that he couldn't manipulate it, and they crashed. So Pullum brought his body back to St. Louis for burial, and Pruitt is recognized in several ways there in St. Louis, including, if you're familiar with the Pruitt-Igoe Housing Project, was named for him. A school was named for him, a veterans club, and some others. Pullum remained in service and eventually rose to the rank of major and was in charge of the entire squadron before desegregation. Okay, so Bertrand Wallace's story is one that I couldn't not tell you. It's not in the book, so listen close. So he was the third musketeer with Pruitt and Pullum. They on campus called themselves the Three Musketeers. They were all in the CPT course together. They were in the same fraternity. Wallace was probably the best candidate as a military aviator that Lincoln had. He came from Kansas City as the most outstanding cadet ROTC officer. He was in consideration for an appointment to the military academy by then Senator Harry Truman. He was elected to class president all 4 years while he was at Lincoln. He was an All-American football player and an All-Conference basketball player for several years. So his story is important because it reflects the discrimination and how it was so easy for their dreams and goals to be sidetracked by a racist organization. So after completing the CPT program, Pullum, Pruitt, Wallace, and several other CPT cadets went to Kansas City. There they took physical, written, and flight exams to enter the U.S. Army Air Corps. And while Pullum and Pruitt went in, had their medical exams, and came right back out, Wallace walked in and the doctor insulted his race. Wallace corrected him, and the doctor said, that's the end of your pilot career, and he failed him on his medical exam. And that was it. So in a matter of 2 sentences, the brightest candidate in the group was forever separated from his dream. So instead, Wallace was part of the 743rd Aviation Military Police. And this was unique because more than 30 members of the Company A were all Lincoln students who had left kind of en masse and went to Fort Riley to be part of this group. And many of them were in the CPT classes. And when they left, they were in the largest convoy of World War II to go over to Europe. They were mostly varsity athletes from football, basketball, boxing, baseball, track, swimming. And Wallace and a couple of the others were part of the basketball team called the New Mexico Five that actually won the Mediterranean Championships the year after they arrived there in Italy. While they were there and doing military police, they primarily were guarding R&R locations where the different military would come to relax after being in service in the battlefield. And they experienced more integration there than anywhere else, and Wallace said that really inspired him. He is one that his stories are recorded at the Library of Congress, so I really encourage you to take a look if you're interested. He's just got a really great story. After serving with the 743rd in Italy, and he came back, he completed his education. He was a printer by trade, eventually working at the New York Times. And he also remained in the military reserves and continued to find white officers who prevented his advancement. But he pushed forward and held his ground and did what he could, and eventually he was in a military police officers school, and he finished 9th out of 88, and turned out to be the only officer of color that was sent overseas to Korea, to the POW camp that he served in. He was the intelligence officer, the deputy provost marshal, and the XO, and within an 11-month tour. So he just persevered. Is really his story. He came back from that, retired from the military, and became a vocational professor and the president of his local NAACP chapter. All right. There we go. So during World War II, one of the big things was the double victory. So victory at home over racism and victory abroad over tyranny. So in the book, I talk about some of that experience that it was at Lincoln as well. Jefferson City was still segregated. There were very few theater seats that were available to Black patrons at that time. That was something that the students were trying to push forward to see more equality in that area. At Tuskegee, they faced discrimination because the town of Tuskegee did not want all of those Black officers there because they were officers, so they could carry weapons and they were supposed to be given a certain level of respect. And the town of Tuskegee really pushed back. One of the things that happened was a soldier had been off base and had been in trouble. He was arrested by the local police and put in their jail, and they called for the MPs to come off base and pick him up. Well, the MPs were armed, right, with their sidearms, and the town beat up the MPs who were coming. All they were doing was coming to town to take their soldier back to base. So they faced certain things like that, and unfortunately, the result of that was that they were no longer allowed to carry weapons off base, which doesn't make sense in wartime, but it was a different time. And then Professor Fulbright, who was part of the 477, was at Freeman Field, and I don't know if any of you have heard of the Freeman Field mutiny. I would not call it a mutiny, but that's apparently how it's reported in some history. But the Black officers and pilots were labeled as trainees, and the white officers were labeled as instructors. So in the officers' clubs, they weren't divided by Black officers' club and white officers' club. It was trainees' club and instructors' club. And some of the 477 were members of the 99th who had already fought overseas as fighter pilots and then came back to help train the 477. So they were definitely not trainees. So they pushed back, and when they were forced to sign a paper, there was more than 100 of them that said, no, I won't sign this paper. And so they were threatened with court-martial, and the benefit of that is it actually brought the higher military organization's attention, and the base commander was actually kicked out at the end of that. So I would call that success. So some of the guys that went on to have incredible stories beyond their military service, barrier-breaking careers. Charles Anderson, he was one of a handful of Black meteorologists during the war. And that was a really unique position that he was in. So after the war, he continued to study polymer chemistry and worked for the Douglas Aircraft, Missiles, and Space Systems for a while. He did pioneering work on the reduction of contrails of high-altitude aircraft, and he was among the first African Americans to earn a doctorate in meteorology from MIT. And he was the first tenured African American professor at the University of Wisconsin. By the end of his career, he was internationally known as an expert on the dynamics of severe storms and was involved in the earliest work using satellite data to predict storms. Walter Sanderson is from Fulton, and by the age of 12, he was working in a machine shop in Fulton. He came to Lincoln, attended the CPT course, and then stayed at Lincoln as a professor. He wound up teaching the national defense classes to dozens of Black men and women who then went into the war industry. So I think he really made an impact on the war. After the war, he opened his own manufacturing company in Chicago and received many of the large government projects as a minority-owned business and kind of led the way there in Chicago for others. So Clovis Bordeaux, we've talked about before. Is he on then? Oh, I didn't give you his picture. All right. Well, after earning his master's degree in physics from St. Louis University, he landed a job at the University of Chicago working with Enrico Fermi on the cyclotron. He moved to Southern California, where he worked for Howard Hughes Aircraft as a supervising physicist when there were very few Black engineers there. He later established a scholarship for physics students at Lincoln with Howard Hughes. Charles Ford, after the war, he remained in the U.S. Air Reserve, reaching the rank of major. He returned to Lincoln as a coach and a PE professor. He became the dean of students after earning his PhD in guidance and counseling. He met his future wife at Lincoln, where she was a coach and PE instructor as well, and continued at Lincoln for another 40 years, even building a house across the street, which is now a Jefferson City historic landmark. And Everett Bratcher. He was hoping to come home, like so many, to have a career in aviation. But again, racism in the system didn't allow for him to work in civilian aviation. So he worked 35 years as a civilian cartographer for the Defense Mapping Agency and was repeatedly recognized for his sustained superior performance. He continued to fly at Scott Air Force Field, and he is recognized with Milton Lemons and Wendell Pruitt in the mural at the St. Louis Airport. So these men are recognized in some ways. They're in the mural, they're in the Alumni Hall of Fame at Lincoln. Bertrand Wallace is in the Lincoln Athletic Hall of Fame. Some of the Tuskegee Airmen were able to receive Congressional Medals of Honor. Professor Fulbright and his daughter went to the ceremony when the president did that. So they have been recognized. But I think that it's important to know the full story for my generation and later generations that didn't grow up with the civil rights in the same form that it was back then, to understand the importance of where they came from and the successes that they had. I just think this is a really important story for Lincoln to show its value and how important it was to so many people's lives pre-segregation. I graduated from Lincoln. I love Lincoln. It's still a great university, but it's important to know its history as well. So I appreciate you coming tonight and listening to these stories. I hope they inspire you.